Hey everybody, welcome back to World History with Mr. Finn. Today we are continuing on with medieval Europe, and we are going to talk about something that is number one on the minds of the people living during this time. If you remember, we had talked about how population was going up, cities were coming back. We talked about the guild system, where people had different professions and how they would, the economy was coming back and some money was coming back and trade was happening again. Now, again, it wasn't exploding. It wasn't like cities started popping up everywhere. However, we were starting to see some normalcy, some city life, something happening that had not happened since the end of the Roman times. So, to that point, good things were happening for the people a little bit. However, their life was rough, their life was hard in a lot of ways, and something offered them a great thing when their life here ended, and that was heaven and the Christian religion that was number one on everyone's mind. This means that the Christian church, the Catholic Church, is going to have a lot of power. So that's something that we want to have known at this time. The church. The church really is number one. Church is number one. It's the most powerful thing, most powerful entity in medieval Europe. Even the kings and the people in charge of these countries had to basically be careful not to do anything to upset the church. So the church at this time, during this time period of, like we're talking about, we're still in the same time period of the year, like 1000 AD to 1300 AD. During this time, the church is number one. During this time, let's have some notes here. It's political. Now, what does that mean? Let me explain. The church is going to be a political entity, meaning that it is not just where you go to get to heaven or to follow the rules of the church and things like that, but it's actually going to be a political player in the sense of governments making sure they're receiving money from all of the different kingdoms and countries. They rule. They have a little bit of ability to rule over kind of all of Europe, and I'm going to tell you why today, briefly, not too bad, with the church and how it's able to have this political power, not just spiritual power. And why is this? Well, let's start with this. There are things within the church called, the church allows sacraments, all right? So sacraments are basic holy rules of the church, things that are allowed through the church, like baptisms and marriages, things like that are sacraments. And so the church has to govern over whether people can get baptized. And if you don't get baptized during this time, if you were a European, this would mean like your soul was damned. And it would be really bad. Obviously, the people of medieval Europe were banking on going to heaven. They needed to go to heaven because their life here was so rough. And so if you couldn't even be baptized because the church did not allow those sacraments in your area, it obviously would be bad. You would turn on the person who was in charge. And so what these sacraments allow the church to do is, if a king or someone in charge was not, playing ball or doing what the church wanted them to do politically, they could say, we're going to do an interdict, which you don't need to know interdict, but it's, the church could, I'll put it up here, could block sacraments. And if a church blocked the sacraments, it would throw a kingdom into chaos. It would be really bad for the person in charge. And so the church is going to kind of have this political power over the kings and the people in charge at this time, because everybody was trying to go to heaven. So it's political. The church is number one. Church, sacraments. Here are some other things that the church did. It governed over something called this: heresy, which is Think of it like this. This will be the definition for us. Crime against the church is what heresy is. So if you committed heresy, you were a heretic. If you were a heretic, you were committing a crime against church, committing a crime against heaven itself. And so this was not able to be governed over by kings and queens, but by the church. And the church had a court called the should I spell it right? Inquisition, which again I just said is a church court. Now the Inquisition would put you on trial and determine if you were guilty or innocent of heresy. And really what the Inquisition would do, and this is what the church would do, the church would not generally convict you of heresy. What they would do is say, hey, listen, if you don't go back and say that you were wrong, we're gonna convict you of heresy. And most people were like, don't want any part of that, because they all wanted to go to heaven, and they believed in the church and believed in the Christian religion and everything. So if you were accused of being a heretic, you would face the Inquisition, the church court, and they would say, hey, you need to retract your statement or take it back. And that way the church had a level of control over pretty much everybody during medieval Europe. So the church itself is going to govern over Europe just the same way that these new kings and queens in these countries were. But they had something that the kings and queens did not have, and that was control over the people's souls, which meant they had a lot of power. And so during this time, as the church is a political player, with these tools, the church is going to get money. It's going to be rich. They're going to get money from all of the different parishes throughout Europe. The different countries would send money and gifts to the church. The church becomes incredibly powerful during this time period. And that's really what we wanted to concentrate on today. There's not much other. Let me take one brief check just because I want to make sure I don't miss anything. We got heresy. You know what? There is another thing. One last definition for us because it could be on our quizzes, which we will be having coming up. The church uses these. Relics. What are relics? They are holy objects. So the church is using holy objects. What we would look at it today in our viewpoint of what was happening with the church and the people of medieval Europe is they were using fear tactics and they were using like brainwashing techniques. All right? So hear me out. Those don't sound good, but trust me, and I'll tell you something in a second. Money and political power and spiritual church, they don't really mix. That's why today the church is not really seen as a political player. It's more of now just concentrating on spiritual stuff, which we'll get to eventually why that happens. But during this time, the church is super corrupt because there's money involved. In fact, I should have this up here so you understand this. The church is rich and corrupt. And you don't think corrupt means I'm going to use this term. It is criminal what they're doing, and it sounds bad. Obviously, talking about the church in those ways today, but the church during this time was not the church of today, depending on what your religion is, and if you are familiar with the Christian religion, it is not the same as it was. So during this time, the church is going to get rich and powerful. It's going to be a political player. It's going to be corrupt. They would sell different offices like the office of cardinal and bishop and archbishop and all of these different positions. The church would like sell them off. So if you're a rich person, you'd be like, hey, I want my kid to be the archbishop of this area because then he'll have an easy life. He'll have a lot of money. He'll have a lot of power. It becomes a political thing, not spiritual. But back to relics. the church is going to use these holy objects to draw people in. Like, hey, come and pray, come and see these holy objects. If you do, this is like good things will happen for you and to you. And so there's like a whole thing of like these fake holy objects that are floating around. People saying like this piece of wood was a piece of the crucifixion of Jesus back, 1,000 so however many years ago. There's no way to prove these things, but because the church would say it, the people would believe it, and these holy objects would draw people in. They'd be like, "Oh my goodness, look what I'm seeing this object," or the bones of this saint, or something like an object of some kind would draw people in and convince them that good they were in the presence of holiness or good things like that. So what we're seeing, and it's important to understand this as we move forward, is the church is going to get a lot of power. Now, here's the thing. Let's get back to what I was going to say. The church is going to get a lot of power. It's rich. It's corrupt. It's selling offices. It's using these relics and other ways to convince people of certain things. It has its own court system, which could try people against the will of like a king or a queen. They could do their own thing. They have independent power to do that. So let's take a look at what's going to happen here. With this, just to wrap up kind of today, is what we're going to see here. Power, right? The church has power. Now, here's the thing about power and politics and money and those things. Power. I'll just use the church since we're talking about church. Wants to hold on to power. So this is going to be something that we're going to see coming up, because we're going to be going into the Renaissance, and then we hit like the Age of Exploration and the Scientific Revolution. It's like bing, 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 some things coming up. But it's important to understand when we get to that point, the church is wanting to hold on to power. It's going to have the ability to. It has the tools to hold on to power with the court system that it has, and heresy and the relics and convincing people of certain things, and independent power over the people of Europe and the kingdoms of Europe. And so once you get money, power, and you're rich, you want to hold on to it. And we're going to see that there's going to be a lot of things that come up where the church is going to be on one side, and whether it's science on the other, whether it's new ideas about religion on the other, whatever it is on the other side, the church is going to do whatever it can to maintain or hold on to this power. So that's it for today. We just wanted to address the fact that we have life going a certain way, but also during this time period, these kingdoms were popping up, these new countries were being formed, we had new kings and monarchies, but above all of it was the church and religion and the belief in Christianity. And the church is very corrupt, it's very powerful, and it is a political player, even more so than spiritual and helping people reach heaven. So that doesn't really work, and we're going to see some problems there, because the church is supposed to be helping people find heaven, do right, follow the church doctrine, those types of things. But as we go, the church is going to be more and more and more concerned with maintaining power, getting money, and it gets more corrupt, and the church gets worse and worse and worse. And so we're going to see some changes having to happen within the church, which we'll get to, but it is important to address it. So today, just give me your notes for attendance and participation purposes, and next time we're going to be moving on. The church is going to have some good things come from it, and that's what we'll be talking next time with the creation of like universities and new writing and things like that. So that's that. Get this to me today, and I will see you next class.